All right, let's get into the polling news. A lot of people asking me to talk about this, and there is a lot of interesting stuff happening, but also a lot of misreporting about some of what's going on. So there is big news out of the 2020 Democratic primary, which is that there are now two polls which show the Democratic primary to be a statistical three-way tie between the presumed frontrunner, former VP Joe Biden, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now, the headlines are going crazy with all sorts of claims that are not backed by the data, and they're ignoring that there have actually been three recent polls, one of which paints a very different picture, which we shouldn't ignore either. So let's look at what we have here, starting with a new Monmouth poll. In the Monmouth poll, you will see that over the last 2 months, Bernie Sanders has jumped from 14 to 20%. Elizabeth Warren has jumped from 15 to 20%. And Joe Biden has dropped bigly from 32 to 19%. This is Biden down 13 points, Bernie and Warren gaining. And when you consider the margin of error, this is statistically, at least possibly, a three-way tie in the 2020 Democratic primary. Everything else, every other candidate, basically identical to 2 months ago. So this is just one poll, and it's a statistical tie. This is not the only poll, however, that says that we now have a statistical tie. There is a new Economist YouGov poll, which has Biden at 22, Sanders at 19, and Warren at 17. When you account for the margin of error, plus or minus a little more than 2.5 percentage points, you have also potentially a statistical tie. And then, and this is what a lot of people aren't talking about, the newest poll of all, is a Politico poll, which says actually Biden's still very solidly in the lead. The new Politico poll, which is not being talked about very much, says Biden 33, Sanders 20, Warren 15, suggesting that everything is basically the way it's been for a month or a little bit longer. So generally speaking, is the race swinging more and more away from Joe Biden? Yes, it is. Is it believable that Joe Biden lost 13 points over the last 2 months, as one poll says? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. It seems like a lot. It seems that there's definitely been a shift away from Biden. And as a progressive, I want a progressive to win the Democratic nomination. So I'm not saying I'm not glad about it, but I'm skeptical that Biden really lost 13 points over the last 2 months. There are still plenty of polls that have Joe Biden ahead. But the big story here, there's no doubt, there is a big story here in terms of the trend line. Trend number one, it's not going well for Joe Biden. He was polling more than 40% when he announced several months ago. Trend number two, Joe Biden's losses are mostly helping Bernie and Warren, not more establishment candidates like Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Now, at some point, this is going to become a real issue. Are Bernie and Warren splitting the progressive vote? I was asked this in an audience question a month ago, or maybe it was more like 6 weeks ago. People have been asking me, shouldn't Bernie or Warren get out in order to let the other progressive consolidate the progressive vote? Because clearly, if Bernie drops, Warren gets all of his support. And if Warren drops, Bernie gets all of her support. I am not so sure about those numbers. I was looking yesterday. Yes, if Elizabeth Warren drops out, some of her support goes to Bernie. If Bernie drops out, some of his support goes to Warren. But there are a number of polls which suggest that the numbers here are a little bit different. One survey has Sanders supporters saying their top second choice is Biden, and Warren supporters saying their top second choice is Harris. And what this suggests to me is that this is much more delineated among demographic lines than ideological. So I don't think we should be too quick to assume that if Bernie drops, his 19% goes to Warren, or if Warren drops, her 17% or whatever goes to Bernie, because the polls right now are not suggesting that that's the case. But at a certain point, there is going to be a question of, will this all work itself out? It's a good thing to see that the progressive movement has 35 to 40% support right now, just among Bernie and Warren. But could it at some point prevent a more progressive candidate from defeating Joe Biden? That is a question we're going to be looking at more this week and into next week. Lastly, there are now 10 people qualified for the third debate in a couple of weeks. It's Biden, Buttigieg, Harris, Sanders, Warren, Booker, O'Rourke, Klobuchar, Castro, and Yang. They've qualified on donor criteria and polling criteria. We have Tom Steyer, Tulsi Gabbard, and Marianne Williamson qualified on number of donors, but not qualified on polling. They may or may not be in the next debate. Everybody else will be out. So the number is starting to diminish. And I think that that is actually a good thing.